All the people here in the Institute are happy to welcome you. New faces, older faces. Um, as many of the rabbis who are here know, um, we at the Institute feel that our deepest mission is fulfilled when you're here. That my father's dream to teach Torah and that Torah should be able to be disseminated and spread. The ideal person who he wanted to teach, and through that, the ideal individual who this institution feels could carry Torah to the Jewish people are you, the rabbis. And you are our most significant other, and you are our most significant students here. And to see you all here and to see the Beit Midrash full is truly a joy. And so, welcome, and I hope you'll find that your weeks of study here will be respectful, will be honest, will give you room to think, room to grow, and hopefully also enriching and inspiring. Our theme is the theme of war and peace. Now, as all of you know, no matter what we do, regardless of what Israel decides to do or doesn't decide to do, fundamentally we don't yet know if the Palestinians have made the strategic long-term decision to accept the Jewish people as a free, sovereign people with their own state here in the land of Israel. And as a result, since we're not certain, as Jews, we are required to hold the course. Because you can't have peace without a peace partner. As all of you know, the only way in which to achieve peace is if you, as an individual and as a community, take an initiative. If you want peace, it's your job to pursue it. It's your job to try it. And if only we will show good intentions, if only we will stop building settlements, if only we will begin to allow Palestinians to live with as much freedom and dignity in the West Bank, if we would make that move, then indeed, peace is possible. As all of you know, the idea of two states, two viable states coexisting between the Jordan and the Mediterranean is fundamentally incompatible with Israel's security needs. As all of you undoubtedly know, in the new battlefield, the notion of strategic space has become irrelevant. And therefore, what was dangerous in the past is no longer dangerous in the present and in the future. And as a result, we have an ability to withdraw from space without inhibiting or harming your security, because space and land aren't vehicles of security. As all of you know, regardless of what we and the Palestinians are going to do, today you have to look at this conflict in the context of a much larger Middle East, in which things are happening which are far greater than whether Mahmoud Abbas accepts Israel as a Jewish state or not. And the reality is so dangerous that even if somebody signs a deal, we have no idea who is going to be the person we're going to have to live with tomorrow. And consequently, the greatest security is found in maintaining today the status quo until the reality of the area in which we live will be clarified. As all of you undoubtedly know, it is our job not to accept what other people define as reality, but it's our job to change our reality. And while we cannot change the forces in Syria and Iraq and other larger global forces, we can, in our space, create a different narrative, if only we have the courage to try to create that narrative. Do we want a self-fulfilling prophecy, or do we want to change our reality? As all of you undoubtedly know, unilateral moves in the Middle East are interpreted as weakness. And whether you think Judea and Samaria is the West Bank or the West Bank is Judea and Samaria, whether you think that the Jewish people have an inalienable right to settle all of the land of Israel or not, and even if, like most Israelis, in theory, aspire for a two-state solution, we have to continue to build settlement after settlement after settlement, because only if we build settlement after settlement after settlement will the Palestinians feel pressure to enter into a peace treaty. The minute you move your leg just ever so slightly from that pedal, the pressure is gone. And even though I don't want settlements, we cannot make any unilateral moves because we've seen what unilateral moves do for us. And as you undoubtedly know, unilateral moves are not a sign of weakness, they're a sign of strength. And as strong people, when you make those unilateral moves, when you determine where it is that you want to go, when you project strongly the values for which you care about, it's only when you have the courage to make those unilateral moves and when you recognize that you're strong enough to make those unilateral moves that it's possible that you will begin to move us out of a status quo and possibly in a direction that we yearn for and hope for. I think I've sort of covered everything. And in our Beit Midrash, every one of these arguments is considered rational, reasonable, and moral. One position doesn't have a higher moral status or claim, either as a lover of peace and a lover of humankind, than the other. One doesn't have a greater claim to love of Israel than the other. One doesn't have a greater claim to worrying about the security and safety of the Jewish people than the other. They're both part of a fundamental debate going on in the Jewish people. And now that I've stated just about every one of them, for the next 2 weeks, they're going to have no place in our Beit Midrash. We're not talking about them. Take it, put it in your binder, actually leave it here because it'll get stolen, and that's exactly what we are. Can we as a people forget that debate for the next 2 weeks? We're not going to agree on these issues. We never have. Not only have we never have, I've never met anybody who changed their minds. Some people, or if you do change your mind, it might be as a result of a personal experience. It is definitely never the result of something that somebody told you. Oh, I didn't realize. Thank you so much. I've never seen that happen in the last 30 years of Jewish debate on left-wing, right-wing politics. You're certain? Great. I am claiming and I'm stating right now that certainty has a place here. Nobody's going to be disrespectful to it. No one's going to deny its moral legitimacy. Just take it and put it aside. Because we want to talk these 2 weeks about something else. We don't want to talk about whether or how we could implement our aspirations. We want to talk about the nature of our aspirations. Leaving completely aside to people's different political sensibilities, sensitivities, knowledges, and certainties, whether those aspirations can be implemented now, tomorrow, and how to do that. But the problem that we have faced, or the problem that we are facing as a people, is I believe we're not talking sufficiently about what we want. What we're going to get is a separate question. But what do we want? What are the values that we believe ought to infuse and shape a Jewish political theory? What are the values and ideals that we should bring to the table when we decide what it is that we yearn for? Statements such as nobody loves peace more than us are frankly getting kind of hollow and stale. What do we want? I remember after the Yom Kippur War, at one of the most dangerous times in Israeli society, it was a few years after we made Aliyah, we were singing about peace. אני מבטיח לך, ילדה שלי קטנה, שזאת תהיה המלחמה האחרונה. I remember song after song after song. Yoram Gaon and Chava Alberstein were like, my soul was carried through their words. We sang about it. We're not singing about peace anymore. And the question is why? Now, there is no doubt that regardless of which one of the positions you agree with that I stated before, one thing we could all agree is that the situation is at least moderately complicated. At least. And that it's just a little more complicated than we used to think it was. And therefore, it could be that it's just getting harder. But the job of artists and poets, and as you know all too well, the job of rabbis, is to present a vision. It's when people are in the midst of despair, you hold their hand, but you stand tall and present hope. Not naive hope, not political hope, but a conversation which asks, okay, ladies and gentlemen, if everything was possible, what would we want? This conference does have a particular political bend. It rejects one opinion, and that is the opinion of the former Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army, Rafael Eitan. Rafael Eitan said, we cannot teach our children to yearn for peace because it's going to weaken them. If we want soldiers, we need to have people who recognize that war will be our eternal destiny. The only position that this conference rejects is that one. We are not taking any position as to what needs to happen politically in order to effectuate a change, either in Israel or in the Palestinian people, nor are we taking any position as to who's to blame. Not here. But we are rejecting the notion that we have to give up on our aspirations. Actually, the other dimension of this conference is the belief that a Jewish people who talks about what they want is a Jewish people who might get closer to achieving it. Not who will, because it's not always in our hands, but who might. And if we don't, we are definitely further away from achieving our goals. So we want to talk about it. We want to talk about the various ideas and values that ought to be part of our conversation. And even more than that, we want to find a way for Jews of very, very different political agendas to talk about Israel. And when you're going to talk about Israel for the next 5 years, part of what you're going to talk about is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And for some, it's going to be that which galvanizes you to support the country on the verge of the next Holocaust. And for others, it's going to be to talk about a country which you feel is fundamentally more distant from Jewish values than you thought, and you wonder whether you can be pro-Israel and Jewish at the same time. And people have very different positions on it. And people have very different positions about what you in North America should do, which organizations you should belong to, who you should campaign, how you should campaign, where you should campaign. Do you say it publicly? Do you say it privately? What does public mean? What does private mean? Does the same thing apply to your lay people? Does it apply to the same thing on campuses? What is the exact reality on the campuses? Are our students being inundated and intact, or are they actually a majority? What is the story? All of the above. Forget about reaching any consensus, but as you all know too well, the consequence is that we don't talk about certain things. And in this institution, not just by us, but an institution which believes in Torah, believes in the power of ideas, it's important that we talk about our ideas. And if we talk about them, we can sing about them. And if we could sing about them, then they remain in front of us, always waiting for a moment when, given each other's different political perspectives, their implementation becomes possible or plausible. What I'd like to do today is to begin that conversation. And I'd like to talk about and learn together, nobody loves peace more than us. I'd like that. Now, I always love those. Nobody loves peace more than us. We're the most moral army in the world. No one's going to teach it. There's some of these liners which are I always wonder, are these empirical? What exactly are they? Like on the basis of which you say nobody loves peace more than us. Okay, it's a nice thing to self-congratulate yourself with, but the question is, what are you even talking about? And if we function from the premise that, of course, everything is fine by us, now it might be that everything is fine by us, but then our job is to reinforce what's fine. And it could be that everything is fine and we have to make sure that tomorrow it'll still be fine. And it is also possible that not everything is fine by us, and therefore we have to talk even more. Either way, we have to talk. So you have a job to do. So let's talk about peace. When we talk about our love for peace, when we pray about our love for peace. Peace, peace, peace. You can almost get nauseous how many times it appears in our Siddur. Oh, the whole Torah is for the sake of peace. Just open up Agna, Bialik. It's just like he has a whole section on it. Look for peace. Do a search on peace. You'll get gazillion sources. Peace, peace, peace. We bless you for peace. God bring us peace. God put peace here for us, for the world, for them together. All the talk about peace. What peace are we talking about? And what happens if the peace we're talking about might actually be very, very different and complicated? What happens if some of the peace we're talking about makes our ability to actually make peace more difficult? What happens if the nature of our peace talk is actually furthering peace? What happens if the nature of our peace is actually a very, very complicated one? And we're going to delve into the way most religious traditions speak about peace. What happens if some of the core Jewish conversations are the most problematic ones? And then for us to move forward in a direction that we want, we either have to reinterpret them, we either have to look at them, we have to deny them, or segregate them, or separate them, or defeat them, because there's something going on in our tradition under the name of peace that we're not confronting sufficiently. And we have to put it on the table. And what is the peace that we actually yearn for? So let's talk. And this is what we're going to do for 2 weeks. But I would like to open up our learning together by an analysis of different notions of peace as they emerge in our tradition. And we studied this theme in our Beit Midrash, and I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Orit Avneri, who's the coordinator of our research center and a fellow, who's teaching on this subject, guided today's class. And the material that I'm presenting is a direct result of the material and of a number of classes that she taught. So from the beginning, I have actually just brought redemption to the world. So Orit, thank you very, very much. Sources on peace. Page 1 we could skip. Because we rabbis actually read the Siddur. We know we pray for it all the time. Shalom Rav al Yisrael Amcha Tasim La'olam Ki Adahu Melech Adon L'chol HaShalom V'tov Yeh Beinecha Levarchenu U'levarech Et Kol Amcha Yisrael B'chol Eit U'v'chol Sha'ah B'shlomecha Barov Oz U'Shalom Baruch Atah Adonai Hamvarech Et Amo Yisrael B'Shalom. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Now, what did we just pray for? The first notion of peace that I'd like to introduce is the notion of utopian peace. And I'd like to distinguish between two notions of utopian peace in a moment. Now, utopian thinking is one of the great gifts and one of the great forces within religious life. Utopian thinking pushes you to not accept or to drown in reality. Utopianism gives you sort of like an anchor to stand on so that you have some horizon about a better tomorrow. And one of the great gifts of religious life is it enables you to hope. It enables you not to get depressed. And there is an unbelievably powerful force for social change embedded in utopianism. But the problem is that utopianism can be a catalyst for activism, but it could also be a catalyst for thinking about that place which is nowhere, which is literally what utopia means. Nowhere. No place. It's a place that doesn't exist. Now, what happens when we put our aspirations on a place that is nowhere? And then we have to live in a real world. And we look at our ideas of nowhere, and those ideas of nowhere, instead of activating some notion of responsibility and behavior, actually become a profound force for pacifism. Because there is no way that I could bridge the gap between this world and nowhere. Nowhere is that more evident than in Isaiah chapter 11 on page 2. The Messiah who comes, the Spirit of the Lord shall alight upon him, a spirit of wisdom and insight, a spirit of counsel and valor, a spirit of devotion and reverence. He shall sense the truth by his reverence for the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes behold, nor decide by what his ears perceive. Thus he shall judge the poor with equity and decide with justice for the lowly of the land. He shall strike down a land with the rod of his mouth and slay the wicked with the breath of his lips. Justice shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his waist. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard lie down with the kid, the calf with the beast of prey, and the fatlings together with a little boy to herd them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion like the ox shall eat straw, and even a little baby shall play over a viper's hole, and an infant pass his hand over an adder's den. It's beautiful. I'd like to live in such a world. This world, however, this notion of peace, is not simply a utopia. It's a utopia which could only be brought forth by God, because it entails a transformation in nature. You could huff and you could puff. Is there anything that we could do that would make a lion and a lamb lie down together? Is that in our power to bring about? So when you say to God, Sim Shalom, what shalom are we praying for? Are we praying for the peace that God has to put? And my job is to wait. And it's not that I want to wait. I'd be happy. I believe God helps those who help themselves. I'm all in. I'm drafted. There's just garnished helping that I could do on this issue. I just wouldn't know what I'm not. How do I train the lion differently? Like, what is it that I'm supposed to do? Like, what? It's just your own mind that the snake pit is dangerous. Just it's mind over matter. Like, there's nothing I could do now. If this is what I pray for, and if this is symptomatic of what we yearn for, then the Jewish people will only be a people who pray for peace, and never be a people who feel that they could do anything about it. And praying for peace will have no implications on your political lives. None. We'll talk about it. We'll talk incessantly. But it is God's to bring and not ours. Do we have a peace, a notion of peace? Or how embedded within our prophetic literature and within our sources is this unbelievably utopian notion of peace, which frankly has nothing to do with how I'm supposed to live my life tomorrow. It's an end of days for which I have to just hope that I will somehow be around. And if I'm not, I'll bury myself here in Israel so I can get here quicker. That's what I got to do. Stick around and hope for Tchiyat HaMetim so that maybe to be activist is to pick your burial plot. That's your activism. Other than that, it's not for me to do. And so one question from the beginning, is peace is something that we have to pursue? Or is peace something that we have to wait for and pray for? According to Isaiah, it's the latter and not the former. Isaiah 2 offers a different version. The words of Isaiah, son of Amos, in the days to come, the mount of the Lord's house shall stand firm above the mountains and tower above the hills. And all the nations shall gaze on it with joy, and many people shall come and go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us in his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For instruction shall come forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Thus he will judge amongst the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war. This might also be even more utopian than lions and lambs. But at least in theory, it doesn't by definition imply a transformation in nature. In theory, it could be a moment of enlightenment when we fundamentally reject Clausewitz, who says that war is politics by another means. We give up that notion. War ceases to be an option. And as a result, we don't need swords anymore. They are tools of irrelevancy. And we decide to disarm and to turn whether we're turning swords into plowshares or we're beginning to use the unimaginable amount of resources directed towards war and redirected for other causes. That is a moment which you could in theory work for. That could be a political platform. That could be an educational platform. That could be something that we want to teach. Remove violence, not just in our schools and not just in our city streets, but remove violence between nations. In many ways, I think that was one of the core aspirations of the United Nations. to be that force which advocates for this policy. Now here it is a utopia of a slightly different form. Because in theory, this is something that I could work for. But what happens when I take Isaiah 2 and move it to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I am willing to dismantle all settlements and give back. I'll even go back to 47 borders, chas v'shalom. Just joking. Yeah, I'm trying to see if you guys have a sense of you ladies have all of it. We're allowed. Part of what we got to do this week is we could joke about these things too. Don't worry. None of the lay people are noticing. Shh. It's a safe space. No one's going to tell you, traitor. Ooh, just let it. We're allowed to. I'll go back to I'll divide, chas v'shalom, all for peace, I'll divide Jerusalem. For this peace. Give me a call when it shows up. Until it shows up, nothing I can do. Because what's peace? Real peace. How many Israelis are for two-state solution and territorial compromise for the sake of peace? Almost everybody. 80%. Now start talking about what they mean by peace. And now we have to begin to figure out whether we've actually said something that's at all relevant for our lives. What happens when we're living in an area where Isaiah 2 is even more nowhere than Isaiah 11? What happens if in our lifetime that's not our story? Do we have a language of partial peace? A language of hudna? Is that part? Do you sit down and say, Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen, and mean hudna? Mean a ceasefire? Mean quiet? Or is this what you mean? And if this is what you mean, how quickly will you be despaired? You know that I travel back and forth between the United States and Israel, but I don't want to speak about the United States. Today, I'll speak tonight. You know it better than I. I'll speak for Israel. I'll speak for Israelis. There is no doubt that the Second Intifada broke the spirit or aspiration of Israelis for peace. There is no doubt. And what we really wanted, what we tasted in Oslo, was Isaiah 2. We tasted it. We yearned for it. We dared to hope for it. We dared to actually think that what we're talking about is not a ceasefire. That maybe what we're really going to have here, precisely because we are so intermeshed and interconnected and our economies are, that we were actually going to have people say, that's just not going to be what we do anymore with each other. Oh, there might be terrorists. And there might be criminals who we have to deal with. But that fundamentally our two peoples, we're going there. And like we exposed, like we opened ourselves up. Like somebody's calling for a date and say, would you like taking the first chance? And our narrative, again, whether it's correct or incorrect, is a matter for outside of this Beit Midrash. But one of the dominant narratives is that they said no. And when they said no, it is not just simply that we said we have to reassess, we have to rethink. We got depressed. We felt rejected. Because what we were yearning for is Isaiah 2. And does utopian peace undermine the ability of a people to make peace? I worry about this a lot. We are very utopian. One of the most beautiful things about the Jewish people is our naivete. We are so naive. But we also have our feelings hurt. And I worry that the dominance of the language of utopian peace within the Jewish tradition has the potential to cause Jews to either relinquish the possibility of peace or be profoundly critical of anybody who is not bringing that type of utopian peace about. That's what you come on, just get together. Just work it out. And so it either causes you to give up the aspiration for peace or give up a willingness to be connected to the real reality, which is Israel within the Middle East. And I think it's important that we have a conversation about utopia and the place of utopia within our language of peace and politics. The second notion of peace, which I would argue together with utopian peace, and there's variations in the utopian peace, which also, at the end of days, does everybody become Jewish? Do people remain different? Compare Micha and Isaiah, they have different. Do we all get together under one God, or do we still maintain our different gods? Look, that's an interesting conversation about how utopian we are in our utopia. The dominant language of peace within our tradition is not utopian peace, I would argue, but it's imperial peace. It's a peace that you would not recognize as peace, but is fundamentally embedded in the notion of monotheism and chosenness, and as a result, you see it over and again in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And every religious tradition could speak about, all our traditions say everything is for the sake of peace, but which peace were you talking about? In this world, it's not utopian peace. In this world, it's imperial peace. And what is imperial peace? One of the classic legal statements about imperial peace is Deuteronomy 20. And as those of you who've studied here many years, this Deuteronomy 20 is the chapter over which I have the greatest Yetzer Hara. My greatest Yetzer Hara that it shouldn't have been here. It's like all of us have like the chapters that we wish didn't make it into the canon. This is my number one chapter that somehow I wish someone spoke to me first. Like I feel like I have a Yetzer Hara to wake up one day and one chapter less. Somehow it disappeared. Why? Because it is the defining chapter of imperial peace. When you approach a town to attack it, you shall offer it terms of peace. Oh, that's sweet. Oh, Jews, you're such a nice people. Why were you attacking it? Oh, I'm sure they did something. I'm sure you wouldn't just start up because Jews don't just start up. The fact that a few verses later on it tells you that these are nations that lie very far away from you actually gets a little depressing because it seems that this is not a war of self-defense, but a war of aggression and conquest to pad your bank accounts. But we are a people who offer peace because, as you know, nobody loves peace as much as the Jewish people do. If it responds peaceably and lets you in, all the people present there shall serve you at forced labor. The language is peace. But what does peace mean? Peace means that you win. Peace means that there is a cessation of war. Here we have a hudna. Here you have a cessation of war. It is ceasefire achieved through surrender, whose consequence is your dominance over the other. That is imperial peace. It's when we are Rome. It's when we are Ashur. It's when we, because all the wars that God fights with us and enables us to ultimately become the superpower. And in our tradition, that is called peace. And turning again to Isaiah, verse 17, at the end on page 6. And I will, verse 17, I will appoint peace as your government, prosperity as your officials. Samti pkudatech shalom. What is pkudatech shalom according to Isaiah? In the end of days, when our peace will be that which rules over our reality. Turn to verse 10. When God finally returns us and redeems us, aliens shall rebuild your walls, their kings shall wait upon you. For in anger I struck you down, but in favor I take you back. Your gate shall always stay open, day and night, they shall never be shut, to let in the wealth of the nations with their kings in procession. For the nation or the kingdom that does not serve you shall perish. Such nations shall be destroyed. Ladies and gentlemen, bruchim habaim, to the period of v'samti pekudatech shalom. It's peace, and it's a peace when we win. And one of our challenges is that so core and fundamental two notions of chosenness is that not only do I have some sense of superiority or greater proximity to God here, but also when peace comes, God doesn't begin to love everybody the same. I'm the chosen people. Don't give me an end of days which gets rid of that. And whether it's in this world or in an end of days, Pkudatech Shalom is, they serve you. So when I see you and I yearn for peace, of course I want peace. Peace is a value. Nobody loves peace more than us. Eretz Yisrael is the land of peace. I could give a speech and move myself so deeply almost to tears. And what I'm yearning for, of course there'll be peace. And by the way, language, which speaks about they never had it so good. They never had it so good. Their salaries are 10 times higher, is a version of imperial peace. Because it says they're different from you. Mandalach sne lechavra chal tavid. No, they're not like you. You want sovereignty. You want freedom. What they want is to make a living. And as long as they're making a living under you, that's peace. We're not talking simply about something that was written thousands of years ago. We're talking about an idea that's translated into Jewish law and is pulsating at the heart of some people's Jewish political theory. And unfortunately, and I'm profoundly embarrassed because you all know, as many of you, I'm Jewish only because of the Rambam, right? If the Rambam didn't exist, no chance I'd be Jewish. And my mother might have been Jewish. But no way I would be a rabbi. No way I would feel that this tradition is a tradition that I could be a part of. It's the Rambam who makes it possible. And that's self-evident. This Rambam, and in all jest, by the way, there's 90% truth. Rambam in Hilchot Melachim u'Milchamot says very simply, war, whether milchemet reshut or milchemet mitzvah, a war should only be waged against someone. You can only fight a war against them until they are offered the opportunity of peace. As Deuteronomy says, when you approach a city to wage war against it, you should propose a peaceful settlement. If the enemy accepts the offer of peace and commits itself to fulfillment of the 7 mitzvot that they were commanded to Noah's descendants, none of them should be killed. Rather, they should be subjugated. Deuteronomy 20 is not only simply not erased by Maimonides, it's turned into one of the core principles of Jewish law. This is the way we fight. He even adds another dimension that, O Goyim, you remember that there's the 7 Noahide commandments that you didn't know about that we think you were commanded? Well, by the way, we're only not going to kill you if you keep them. Not only are you subjugated to us politically, you are subjugated to us religiously. And if you accept that, then I allow you the wonderful status of slavery. If you don't, then I kill you. This is in the Mishnah Torah. This is not in some esoteric Kabbalistic text that nobody understands. This is Hilchot Melachim and the Rambam. And as you all know all too well, there are political parties built around Hilchot Melachim. There is, however, a third notion of peace. The problem is, it is unbelievably rare. And even when it exists, as I'm going to show you, it's really problematic. And that is the peace of justice. And by the peace of justice, as distinct from the peace of the imperial peace, here, the idea of peace is not for me to control you, but for me to live side by side with you. A peace in which I recognize that along with my commitments to my inalienable rights, I recognize your inalienable rights. And that you have a fundamental right to be free, sovereign, in possession of your land and in your property, defended from me or protected from me regardless of whether I have the power, because might does not make right. But just as two individuals learn how to share the public sphere together, so two nations learn how to share international space together. The idea, a hinting of this, appears in Deuteronomy 2. And Deuteronomy 2, as many of you know, is the chapter in which God plays duck, duck, goose. What is duck, duck, goose in the Bible? Don't fight, don't fight, don't fight, don't fight, fight. That's biblical duck, duck, goose. Don't touch them, they're connected to Yishmael. Don't touch them, they're connected. I have a cheshbon with them. You know, I owe them, I did this, I said. No, go. That's what this, you read the chapters. No. And it ultimately leads to an understanding, I wrote about this in an article many, many years ago, that one of the core principles of biblical morality of war is the war sanctioned by God. Not a distinction between self-defense and aggression, but a war sanctioned by God and a war non-sanctioned. The war non-sanctioned is unjust war, and the war unsanctioned and the war sanctioned is just without, regardless, whatever God wants. Now, God decided, as we see in Deuteronomy 20, up. Don't. Goose, up. Set up across Wadi Arnon. See, I give it into your power. Sichon, the Amorite king of Heshbon and his land. Begin the occupation, engage him in battle. God says, fight them. Why? Why should you fight them? This is not part, and I'm going to leave aside what's going on here vis-a-vis the 7 Canaanite nations. I'll leave that aside. But this is not even part of the 7 Canaanite nations. Why am I fighting against Sichon Melech Heshbon for? Like, I have no Heshbon with Sichon Melech Heshbon. No, like, I have no claim on anything there. Why? God says, this day I begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the peoples everywhere under heaven, so that they shall tremble and quake because of you whenever they hear you mentioned. Very simple. The capture of the land, while it's miraculous, will go much simpler if everybody's petrified. As one of we just had a visit here from a very senior officer in the Israeli army who was talking to us about a number of issues, and he was saying that is the methodology, how ISIS, I think that's their name, is capturing Iraq. If you scare the living daylights out of everybody, if you murder, pillage, and rape enough people, you break the spirit, and then you won the war before they've even entered into the battlefield. And that's what they said. This is what we wanted Israel to do. God found a patsy, a nice little country, which probably didn't have a big army. They're right near. They're on the way. Go. I need to build, Jews. I need the world to know that you are now Sabras. You're tough. You're not the slaves from Egypt anymore. You've made it. I need you to have a victory under your belt. kind of problematic in contemporary morality of war, but in biblical morality of war of duck, duck, goose, where the just war is the one commanded by God, it's no less just or not just than any of the others. The problem is, then I, Moses, sent messengers from the wilderness of Ktemot to King Sichon of Heshbon with an offer of peace. God says, duck, duck, goose, and Moshe says, this is not a goose, I think this is a duck. And I'm going to treat it like a duck. What does it mean to treat you like a duck? What is the peace of justice? Let me pass through your country. I will keep strictly to the highway, turning off neither to the right nor to the left. What food I eat, you will supply for money. And what water I drink, you will furnish for money. Just let me pass through. Just like the descendants of Esau. Those are the ones that God said were duck. I didn't touch them. I want you to be my duck. I'm just like I did with Esau and with Seir and the Moabites. Please, somewhere I want to go. I have no claim on your space. I respect your space. And if the chapter ended here, life would be good. We now have an idea that there is a notion of peace of justice. Where it applies, it could be a complicated issue, but at least it's on the books. I don't just have imperial peace, and I don't just have utopian peace. I have a real peace here. I could see you, and I accept that not everybody, the whole world wasn't created lisham sheni, to serve me. The only problem is that again, the Bible continues. But King Sichon of Heshbon refused to let us pass through, because the Lord had stiffened his will and hardened his heart in order to deliver him into your power. God says, I get to decide who's a duck and who's a goose. And ultimately, God's actions undermine Moshe's notion of the peace of justice. God wipes out the category. Wipes it out. In a similar form, in Genesis 13, Avram and Lot look at each other, they're fighting, and Avram says, I frankly don't want to fight. There's something more important to fighting. There's something more important to me owning all of the land of Israel. What's enough for me is to have some. What's more important is that we don't fight with each other. In verse 6, so that the land would not support, they had lots of Lot who went with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support them staying together, for their possessions were so great that they could not remain together, and there was quarreling between them, Nebuch, and it was terrible, and it was just not the way people should live with each other. So Abraham said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, between my herdsmen and yours. We're kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Let us separate. You go north, I'll go south. You go south, I'll go north. I don't need it all. I don't need it all. You take it. I relinquish my inheritance. It's yours, not mine. The land is big enough for us to share. It's beautiful. And again, if the text would have ended here, we would have this beautiful notion about how coexistence is more important than Kedushat Eretz Yisrael, and life would have been great, and there never would have been Gush Amunim. But then on verse 14, God talks again. And the Lord said to Abram after Lot had departed from him, good move. Nice try. Raise your eyes and look out from where you are, to the north and the south. The echo of the north, south. Look north and south. That area you gave Lot his pick. Now I want you to look wherever Lot went. Look north and look south. And by the way, also look east and west. For I give all of the land that you see to you and your offspring forever. You think you relinquish the land? You think the peace of justice and allowing someone else to coexist in your land is going to trump? You did it between you and Lot. It has nothing to do with whom? The future. I decide. And it's all yours. And so as these, by the way, are the only, searching high and low, and had other searching high and low. Find me verses, sections on the peace of justice. Garnished Helfen. It's not there. it's almost always imperial peace. And even when we have little inklings of peace of justice, the type of peace that we would like to have with Palestinians today, there is almost no evidence of such a peace within our Jewish tradition. And we are on uncharted territories when we try to apply some parts of our tradition to our contemporary reality. This was not, you see somebody, I maybe have a piece of justice, but then it's too utopian. Here, between not tomorrow when God's going to bring it, but between me and you now, here and now, you try it, and God says, sorry, that's not my plan. Thank God, however, God doesn't always get the last word. Sometimes the rabbis do. Turn back, please, to page 10. And Israel sent messengers. This bears on what Scripture says, trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and cherish faithfulness. It also says, depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. Now the Torah did not insist that we should actually go in pursuit of the commandments, but said, if a bird's nest chanced to be before thee, if thou meet thine enemy's ox, if thou seest the ass of him and of him that hateth thee, when thou beatest thine olive tree, when thou gatherest the grapeyards of thy vineyard, when thou comest into thy neighborhood's vineyard, etc. In all these cases, if they come your way, you are commanded to perform the duties connected with them. But you need not go in pursuit of them. Most of Torah are commandments, shemizdamnim. When the reality comes, this is how you behave. In the case of peace, however, it says, seek peace wherever you happen to be and pursue it, even if it is elsewhere. And now look what the rabbis say, because when you read Deuteronomy, God says, I'm not interested in your peace. The rabbis reread the text and say, Israel, in fact, acted in this way. And Moses was not rebelling against God's word, but he was actually fulfilling God's word from another place. Although the Holy One, he, blessed be he, said to them, begin to possess it and contend with him battle, they pursued peace, as should be. According to this rabbinic idea, the pursuit of peace of justice was never overmined by God. Actually, what we do is we change God's ending. Why did God do what he did to Cheshbon? Don't pay attention. That's not the Judaism. That part of chapter 2 is not our Judaism. We have a different God who says the pursuit of peace of justice, this is Judaism. Okay, so now we could breathe. There is some peace of justice in our tradition, but it's competing. And you have to use creative interpretation, but most of Judaism is creative interpretation. But we have to understand that we who love peace more than anyone in the world are going to have a lot of work to do with our sources. And similarly, the rabbis say, another exposition of the text, then sang Israel, this is one of the three things that said by Moses to the Holy One, blessed be he, to which the latter replied, you have taught me something. There are three things. The Torah is, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemor, Daber b'nei Yisrael v'amart lehem, and Moshe tells exactly what God tells the Jewish people, what God said. There are three times when Moshe does something on his own. And there are three times when he does it on his own, and God says, B'chayecha, you were right. Limadetani, you taught me something. Now, according to chapter 2, Moshe says, let's pursue peace, and God doesn't even answer him. You're like a little pawn in my plan. God doesn't even feel that Moshe is worthy of response. Not, however, in the eyes of the rabbis. In the eyes of the rabbis, the peace of justice becomes a fundamental idea that Moshe teaches God. Moshe teaches peace of justice, that it should override imperial peace, and God accepts it. The third occasion was when Moses said, make war with Sichon, even though he does not seek to interfere, you must pass, etc., etc. But Moses, however, did not do so, but said, I sent messengers. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, by your life I shall cancel my own words and confirm yours. And where does God cancel his own words and confirm Moshe's? he rewrites Deuteronomy 20. That's also imperial, but that's too much details. In the act of interpretation, we're recreating our rabbinic tradition. Our tradition, what the rabbis are here doing are creating a foundation for the idea of a piece of justice. It's here, but it's small. And it has to fight all the time with the theological foundations of imperial peace. To conclude, there's another piece. Not only the peace of justice, but also a real peace. And I want to read just one source. The word of the Lord of hosts came to me. Thus said the Lord of hosts, I am very jealous for Zion. I am fiercely jealous for her. Thus said the Lord, I have returned to Zion and I will dwell in Jerusalem. Jerusalem we call the city of faithfulness, the mount of the Lord of hosts, the holy mountain. Thus said the Lord of hosts, there shall yet be old men and women in the squares of Jerusalem, each with staff in hand because of their great age. And the squares of the city shall be crowded with boys and girls playing in the squares. Thus said the Lord of hosts, though it seems impossible to the remnant of this people in those days, shall it be impossible for me, declares the Lord? Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will rescue my people from the lands of the east and from the lands of the west, and I will bring them home to dwell in Jerusalem, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God in truth and sincerity. Well, this peace we're beginning to feel. We have returned from the east and to the west. Now, we might not be able to return here and have swords turned into plowshares. But could we create a reality in which the squares of Jerusalem are filled with old men and women? That children could play? That children could go hitchhiking? Is that possible? It is. That's not the same as turning swords into plowshares. Maybe the way we achieve it is not by having some abolishment of the concept of war or the abolishment and transformation of human nature. Maybe we accomplish it through power. But we could come home and we could build a country where we could get old. And where not only could old people get older, but that young people could get old too. This doesn't, while for other generations, this was utopia. For our generation, this is not no place. We could taste it. Not only could we taste it, we already have a huge part of this. It's not stable. It needs to be preserved. It needs to be protected. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be watched. But maybe that's all we should look for. And so we are a people who pray for peace. We do. And I don't know if there is no people in the world who yearns for peace more than us or not. But I know that our people truly yearn for peace. I would even go so far to say that the vast majority of our people are willing to relinquish the notion of imperial peace. It does exist, and it has political parties. And it is a Yetzer Hara which all of us have inherited. And one of the things we learn about Israel is that ideas, even when they aren't dominant, they're still somewhere in your consciousness and they're part of your story. I have to come out on top. I have to win. Even in a compromise is a form of this, is a footprint of this imperial stuff. It's there. And it's part of our consciousness. And only if we recognize it can we deal with it. I think most people would be willing to embrace a piece of justice. The question that we face is, have we given a piece of justice only over to the realm of the utopia? And if we have, are we serving our people well? The challenge is not simply to pray for something. Embedded within the Zionist revolution is the idea that we Jews, while we might pray or we might not pray, we are definitely taking history into our hands. So now what are we going to do? We have to make sure that when people pray for peace, they actually think what peace they're willing to pray for. And from the prayer will come song. And from song will come action. And from action might come a new reality. Ken Yehi Ratzon. Thank you. And now we have some time for questions, please. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Donniel. That's Sharif from Rutgers Hillel. It's great to be back for my first time at RTS after completing the Hillel campus cohort.
That was the idea. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. In your opening remarks, you went through a whole variety of different statements about things that we're not supposed to bring up again, but I'll very briefly just say, you said that one of the statements you made is that the greatest security for Israel is to maintain the status quo. It sounds to me like the real peace, where people can just stay here and grow old, is exactly that, maintaining the status quo. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Thank you. The question is, I don't know whether where people getting old and children, when our children are getting kidnapped, or when, I don't know how much of a status quo you have. Now, let's be clear. Most Israelis do live in safety. We're not living in the midst of ongoing fear. But it is not a stable, we haven't achieved a stable reality. And part of that stability, and then again, that's where politics come in. How do you achieve that? Is it achievable or not? That's what I don't want to talk about. What I want to talk about is, what are you yearning for? Are you yearning for this? Are you yearning that Lola? Or are you saying Lola Mesav Sonet Yaakov, and this is our destiny? And let's just, are you Raphael? Has Raphael Eitan won? Have we come so close and tasted failure that we've given it up? And has utopia ruined us for a real world? So while it's real, it's not exactly. There's a lot to do to achieve a stable Zechariah. It's not just the other. Yes, please, in the back. Can I just see, let me just have an idea that in the first round, who'd like to ask something so that we could, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anybody else? We're good with those 5, okay? You saw the 5 who raised, so in whatever order, please start.
Following up on the Zechariah text, that piece is described for us. It doesn't talk about the other.
I know.
And I wonder where's the place of the other in that real piece.
Very nice. It doesn't. It doesn't. Number one, next time I teach it, I'm going to point that out. So, thank you very much. Limadatani already. That's, as you're preparing it, I took it that far. I didn't really assimilate the next side. So, number one, thank you. I'll even take that. I'll even take that. There is no doubt that in the piece of justice, you do have to see the other. And that you do want that alongside our elderly or seniors, that someone else's elderly and seniors could live in peace as well. So, absolutely correct. Isaiah, it still is maybe what you're telling me, and I like that point, is that even in this real peace, a certain level of imperialism is there, where we're too narrow. Thank you very, very much. Yes, please.
I don't think that God promised to Abraham of the full territory, following his compromise with Lot, not only a part of the territory, necessarily is imperial. Because you can interpret, Agarab, you can interpret just the other way. You could say, Abraham, I approve of the fact that here in this reality, you are willing to make territorial compromise. But don't worry, someday, okay, your people will have the whole land. I don't think there's anything wrong now, if you want to apply it to today, with a believing Jew saying, yes, theoretically the land belongs to the Jewish people. But just like Abraham, we make territorial compromises for the sake of peace. And God is actually not being imperial. He's encouraging Abraham to say, yes, compromise, but someday, have a moon that someday the land will be yours.
That could very well be. And I accept that as a perfectly legitimate reading. Not that you need me to accept it, but let's just put it on the table. I'm not arguing with the reading. But I would ask you a question, and this is something that Micha is going to speak about in his class. What happens when on your books you still have an end of days, which has a certain form? And one of the things that happens is that your aspirations, your utopias, sometimes undermine your ability to live in reality because it's so far, and sometimes they shape what you yearn for, and as a result, you sort of, it's only tomorrow, but isn't it my job to try to bring it closer today? If you really, really believe that in the end of days, in the Middle East, there should be only one people. In our area, in Gvulot Eretz Yisrael, there will one day be one people. And that an acceptance of the reality of the Palestinian people, take it the Bibi Netanyahu Bar Ilan position, the official doctrine of the official position of every single Israeli government for years, is the two-state solution, that's just a solution, a temporary solution, till God returns to history. I don't want to suggest, I would argue that holding on to that is going to have a profound impact, not merely on what we pray for tomorrow, but also on what we're committed today. And it's very, very hard to hold that duality of, and that if I truly yearn for a piece of justice, then I'm also yearning that in the end of days, that piece of justice will be. And if you want a parallel to it, look at our discussion very often with Christian evangelicals. In the end of days, it's really important to us. Are we all going to become Christian or not? Because we know that what you yearn for tomorrow it's shaping you today. It's not just tomorrow's conversation. And part of the utopia of this nowhere is shaping you today because it's making you unable to live in imperfect realities. It's unable for you, on one hand, that ideology also asks them, so how, because at the end, do you take chances for this? Do you risk it? How does it compete with other values? All value conversation is a conversation between different conflicts. And when you add the perfectly legitimate narrative that you're mentioning, I would suggest it's going to influence. Now you might say Gesundheit, and that again is perfectly legitimate, and that would be subject to the conversation we're not having here. We're not having it, and I'm saying perfectly legitimate. I have no qualms. I'm not attacking it. I'm just saying be aware that it does have an impact. It's not just what it will be tomorrow doesn't stay tomorrow. Beware what you yearn for, because your aspirations are going to shape your politics in the present.
Yes, please.
Yeah, in Isaiah chapter 19, there's a famous passage that many who are try to reinterpret some of the difficult passages in the Torah that you alluded to bring this as the core text of a solution. In that day, the Israel shall be a third partner with Egypt.
We also have an imperial Israel, or do we not? There's a few sections, Isaiah, Amos, in which in the end of days, there is a recognition that God has multiple loves, and that it's not our victory. Like, let us, even Isaiah 1, let us go up to the house of God. To the house of whom? What's it repeats? House of? You remember the verse in Isaiah? House of the God of Jacob. It's like this city which now belongs to everybody has our flag over it. In other words, so there is that is a move that goes back and forth in our tradition. Who wins at the end? Is that part? And that's a section which relinquishes that as well. It's just not consistent. Yes, please, and then yourself. Now, just wait, everybody. I'm just teasing you. I know. without violating a cardinal rule not to speak about Islam, not in the presence of or not having a Muslim scholar speaking for you. Because Jews' conversations about Islam tend to be sometimes at best embarrassing. At best, sometimes fundamentally morally corrupt. Not saying it all again. I would say to you, the one thing that I guarantee you, that within Islam, there is also the notion of imperial peace. And that's not being polemical. It is also there. And that some of these texts are absolutely texts of, therefore you could use the word, but what is the word that you're yearning for? And the peace yearned by the Crusaders in Christianity was not the peace of justice. So you're absolutely correct. And it's an important point because it's all of us. Because you could just, we're just saying blah, blah. It's just blah, blah. Part of what, the reason why I'm opening with this theme for this conference is let's not bullshit ourselves anymore. No more blah, blah. It's like, and then you just you're just like, it's like you're at some kiddush where you're choking on your own self-righteousness and you're nauseous. It's just not helping you, because you're eating your own self-fantasies. We have some work to do. And we have a conversation to have with our people. And we have nuances about peace. And our problem doesn't start with Islam. It might continue with Islam. But our problem starts with, let's talk about us. And so, and to start a real conversation. Yes, please, sir. And then the last, yes. Oh, please, yes.
Okay, actually, it follows up on both concepts. So whichever piece we might be talking about, we do have a prayer, the Amidah, 3 times, and every time we pray, peace. Whatever peace we mean, imperial or justice or whichever one. So, and I don't think that there is such a regular parallel in Christianity. I think that Muslim prayer in its form is much closer to Muslim prayer, 5 times a day, etc. I know nothing about Muslim liturgy. I'm just curious, is there some kind of prayer for peace that is as constant there too?
I'm going to leave that as a question to be answered by somebody else. It's outside of my competency, and it's outside of the competency of the Beit Midrash, but it's a very good question that is worthy for conversation. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, sir.
As you say that maybe we should try to change the reality, but you say also that utopia shapes the reality, right? So from here, what I think is like trying to cure the symptoms of the disease. Instead of just trying to change the reality, we should maybe try to change the utopia of a reality that talks about an imperial Israel, right? And you see Gush Emunim and all the centers and this rhetoric. And in the other hand, a utopia of a Middle East without Israel and a Jerusalem without Jews, that are also changing the reality of the other side. So shouldn't we work on trying to change the utopia?
Oh, thank you. Absolutely. As I say, utopias influence us, but utopias could they influence you. They might disempower you. They may cause you to be constantly dissatisfied with the imperfection that you experience. They might cause you to take what you seem to be committed to now and really wink and say, yeah, it's only a temporary measure. All of which have a profound impact. Now, I'm not saying give up utopian conversation. I'm saying be aware of its impact on you. And you're right. We do have to shape our utopias. What is the utopia that we yearn for? As you said, do we just yearn that our people will get older and our children will be dancing and playing, or do we also yearn that other people will? In our utopias, do we win or do we not win? How do we create new utopias? A lot of our old utopias are very, very imperial. Not all of them. There are some imperial utopias, and as Robert presented, there are some utopias which aren't as imperial. Which are the utopias that are going to win? It might very well be, or might be one of the most interesting conversations to have. But even when all is said and done, And with this I'll conclude, utopia is powerful. Utopia is one of the great gifts of a religious life. That's what faith involves, a willingness to believe that something could be greater than the present. And the strength of character of a person of faith is someone to be able to look into reality and say, no, I'm not going to succumb to you. Next year in Jerusalem was one of the greatest utopias in Jewish history. But one of the problems with next year in Jerusalem is that Zionists said, you kept it alive, but you got so used to praying for it. Enough, you're nauseating me. You are these great activists in your shuls. The job of a utopia is not just to remain a utopia, but actually to cause you to do something. Now, when you have a good utopia, there could be a moment when people of greatness stand up and say, okay, im lo achshav matai, and they go do something. When you have a bad utopia, there might be people who get up and say, im lo achshav matai. And they might take that utopia and say, I want to implement it now. And so utopias are influencing us in many, many different ways, as, by the way, they are influencing very deeply our neighbors. Very, very deeply our neighbors. It's, if I have one goal, it would be for us to recognize that the conversation about peace needs to be complexified. It needs to be nuanced. We need to spend time on it. A people aren't committed to bringing peace, if it is possible, if they merely pray for it. We need to take it out of the shul, take it out of just the siddur, and begin to have conversations about what it is that we yearn for. Now here comes the great challenge. Could we talk about it under the rules that I set forth at the beginning of my talk? Could you talk about it in your shul with the same rules? Because part of what's happened is that we have great values that we need to reconnect to, but we're not. Not because we've given them up, not because they stop being important, but because the divisiveness in Jewish life is so great that we can't even talk about our values anymore. And if we can't talk about our values, if we can't teach them, regardless of our politics, then the Jewish people, then we're not serving the Jewish people the way we need to serve them. And how do we create a space where we could serve them in that way? How do we create a space where we could talk about peace? Knowing fully well that life is very complicated. But what shouldn't be complicated is what we yearn for. Welcome, and I hope we have a great, great 2 weeks together.